Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers of Jazz Congress for having us here, Jazz at Lincoln Center and Jazz Times. Thank you all for showing up for this conversation. That was the late, great Hugh Masekela. We thought it was a wonderful way to set the tone. We were talking about the contribution of the African continent to the jazz idiom, past, present, and future. I am Somi. I'll be hosting and having a conversation, leading the conversation, or just joining in a conversation with these dear friends of mine. I'm a vocalist, a writer, a producer here, based in New York City, originally from Uganda and Rwanda. So I'm just going to introduce my esteemed panelists who are here with me. As I said, they're really very dear friends, but also colleagues whom I respect and admire greatly. So this is Meklit Hadero, known as Meklit in the music world. Meklit is an Ethiopian-born, US-raised Ethio-jazz vocalist, songwriter, composer, and cultural activist. She is the new chief of programs at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, as well as a National Geographic Explorer, a TED Senior Fellow. Her TED Talk has been watched by more than 1.2 million people, and her music videos air daily on Ethiopian television. Meklit has collaborated with Kronos Quartet and musical legend Pee Wee Ellis. She has completed residencies at Harvard, NYU, Purdue, and received musical commissions from Lincoln Center and Map Fund. Her last album, When the People Move, the Music Moves Too, was named among the best albums of 2017 by Sunday Times UK, KQED in San Francisco, and Bandcamp. Meklit's music has been covered by NPR, BBC, CNN, Washington Post, Jazz Times, Vibe Magazine, and many more. She is the co-founder of the Nile Project and holds a BA in political science from Yale University. So please welcome Meklit. Nduduzo Makhathini, if it's okay. I'm gonna go that side. Nduduzo Makhathini, gentleman on the far right, or your far left, hails from KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. He identifies equally as healer, scholar, and musician. He holds a master's degree in music from Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, where he also currently is working on his PhD. Makhathini has toured extensively and recorded with other strongly rooted titans like Zim Ngwana. Yes, sorry, thank you. Busi Mhlongo, Fea Faku, Carlo Mombelli, Salim Washington, and Herbie Tsaweli, to name a few. Prolific in his creative pursuits, since 2014, he has released 8 albums that have earned him multiple awards, including 2 South African Music Awards, also known as SAMA Awards, for Best Jazz Album, an Afrima Award, the All Africa Music Award, and a Standard Bank Young Artist Award. Makhathini has formed impressive working relationships on this side of the Atlantic as well, most recently being a featured guest with Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra and Wynton Marsalis. And he also just became the first Africa-based artist to sign to the historic Blue Note Records. And we'll release, we can give a round of applause. And he'll be releasing his latest release, his 9th album as a leader, in April 2020 on Blue Note, called Letters from the Underworld. So please look out for that. Yes, we can clap again. Brenda Sisane, here, the wonderful, beautiful woman in the middle, joined the tourism industry as a public relations manager and later the broadcasting world as a radio and television presenter, which launched her PR consulting firm in 1995. She has diversified her business to specialize in international relations and cultural diplomacy. She founded Spin Productions, its nonprofit sister organization, the Spin Foundation. She served as board advisor and producer of many significant global events in South Africa, such as the Millennium Television Network Y2K events, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and the South African Jazz and Health Alliance. She is an award-winning radio presenter whose weekly show, The Art of Sundays, is a Johannesburg favorite and my favorite. For young musicians and enthusiasts of jazz on South Africa's biggest jazz radio station, Kaya FM. She also founded the International Jazz Day South Africa initiative. In April 2020, Brenda will serve as the first woman to host the official International Jazz Day alongside UNESCO and the Herbie Hancock Institute of Jazz. And she'll produce the 2020 All-Star Global Concert in Cape Town, South Africa. that she has chosen a theme called Tracing the Roots and Routes of African Jazz. So please welcome Brenda Sisane. So I wanted to start, we were listening, as I said, to Brahyu. I wanted to start by reflecting on past contributions from the continent to the jazz idiom and the legacy that stands both in the public imaginary and in ourselves. So I wanted to ask each one of you to share what your perception of the world's perception of the work that we do as Africans on the global cultural stage is. Meklit, would you mind starting?
Well, in terms of Ethiopian jazz, a lot of the public imagination has been shaped by the Ethiopique series, which was actually put out by the French label Buddha Music and Francis Falsetto. Those classic recordings were made in what's considered the golden age of Ethiopian of Ethio jazz, which was about 1968 that lasted until the revolution happened in 1974. And they were actually lost recordings that were found in a studio in Greece. But anyway, that period of time was an incredibly fertile moment for Ethiopian music. The icon that people really associate with that era and time is the great Mulatu Astatke, who's considered the godfather of Ethiopian jazz. He was the first African to attend the Berklee College of Music. There was a famous encounter between him and John Coltrane. He would come to New York all the time when he was in Boston at Berklee College of Music, and at that time he was playing a lot of Latin jazz, and John Coltrane said, "Man, you gotta trace your own music," and that really, really, really stuck with him. At the same time, he was being deeply influenced by the Cuban musicians who were taking their traditional music and bringing it into a jazz idiom, and between those two kind of points and poles, when he returned to Ethiopia in the late 60s, he started digging into what it would mean to merge the pentatonic scales of Ethiopian music with the 12-tone diatonic scales of Western music through the jazz idiom, and he created Ethio jazz. But at the same time, I really want to mention that it wasn't just him, that this was part of a global music wave that was happening. How could American jazz and African music have that dialogue? I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that today. And it wasn't, and as I said, it wasn't just him. So there's an artist by the name of Buena, who was one of the main arrangers of Ethio jazz. He doesn't get the credit that Mulatu Astatke gets, but he was a very big part of that scene. And then, of course, there were artists like Hailu Margia, and all of those folks are having a resurgence now. So it's actually a really wonderful moment for Ethiopian music to see the legends that created the music having their time to be able to really be appreciated while they are here. Like, we need to appreciate our icons and our heroes while they are with us. But I would say that series Ethiopiques, when it came out in 1997, that was the beginning of the public imagination around what Ethio jazz is. And then in 2005, Jim Jarmusch put most of what is Ethiopiques Volume 4, which was Mulatu Astatke's volume, into his film Broken Flowers. And at that point, it was like lightning. Mulatu Astatke had spent much of the rest of the 70s, the second half of the 70s after the revolution, and all of the 80s as a professor at the Yared School of Music in Ethiopia and living as just a music teacher. And in 2005, when that film hit, he suddenly had an international touring career. He's one of my mentors. And when we think of Ethiopian music in the popular public imagination, he is our lightning rod.
Thank you. I'm just going to restate the question if you need me to, just so that everybody who's just joining us, what is your perception of the world's perception of the work that we're doing as Africans? Thank you.
Thank you, Somi. Hello, everyone. I think I'll speak as a broadcaster because Nduduzo is here and he can speak also as a scholar and historian. But as somebody who works in the public domain in terms of just conversing around the music, I find that there's a lot more, for instance, that I recognize in what Meklit was saying, wherein whenever people are misplaced, where the art finds resonance, and the question becomes how how it gets transcribed and given back. For instance, you talk about who is not getting the due credit, you know, that the question that I realize is that a lot of perspective exists, but some of them are not written or documented by us in a full scale wherein we can reflect the true scale of the whole, of the narrative. But I also get a sense that, I mean, for us as South Africa, the parallel streams around which the jazz music came to the South African shores and how we embraced it and started, how artists at the time started creating products that reflect their relationship with jazz music or even their understanding. And I also find that while we at that, you know, there's a great relationship with America as such in terms of solidarity during different times in South Africa, wherein a lot of artists like Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, Kaifa Semenya, and Letambulu, and all of them, you know, were able to raise the interest and the particular texture of South African music. But then, in reflection, I also find that I even wonder myself, you know, whenever you talk to an artist, a musician, and you reflect your understanding of their work at an intrinsic level, I wonder if it is understood that it's because we see ourselves in the music, we follow the music, we understand, we love the music, but also that we practice the music. I think these are the questions I ask myself as a broadcaster. And also, you know, the question of saying, sometimes we tend to talk about jazz music, and then we talk about South African music. So this is where I feel, you know, in the times that we're in now, it's great to reflect because we're sitting at a time where we're going forward by looking back. More than ever, we are reflecting on the true status of our identity, of our contribution, of our elders and knowledge systems that come from our cultural backgrounds that are informing more and more how young artists are emerging. And Nduduzo is a living example of that. You know, if you can catch his phrasing, letters of the underworld, listening to the ground, talking about spirit and how it lives in the creation of music. So that's where I feel that there's this interesting things in terms of how we are perceived, how the African music is perceived, but also it needs to be brought into a much more integrated package of knowledge.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think what Sis-B is saying, I mean, I resonate a lot with what you just said, especially with regards to the ways in which we have these kind of multiple consciousness, especially around the idea of how we define this music, because in South Africa in particular, this music is defined by both an experience in the continent, in the country, but also usually described and defined by the contributions that were made in exile and in the diaspora. So it's very interesting when we try to think about the past, because we have to also consider the question of what is then left. And I think in trying to speak about jazz, we always get caught in this idea of South African jazz. Actually, ethnomusicologists back home are preferring the term jazz in South Africa as opposed to South African jazz. So there are these politics, you know, that surround language, that surround identity, that surround geographics. And I think it's important, therefore, when we try to speak about jazz, to also think about the past, not just as the past when jazz received the tag or the name jazz, but the fact that Brenda is reflecting on these cultural nuances, these cultural concepts that are in themselves jazzy, you know what I mean? So this music, at least the construct, at least the matrix of the music have always existed. You know, I was talking to someone about like how jazz is usually described by improvisation, and we're talking about you know, how the word improvisation in itself becomes problematic, at least in an African, you know, sort of idea. Because, for instance, when you say improvisation, it sounds like you had failed to do something, and then you improvise. At least that's what, you know, the idea of the English language and the protocols, that's at least what it allows us tap into. But on the contrary, if you think about how we think of improvisation around definition, around ngoma, in an African context, so we emerge from the space of improvisation. It's not something that we think about when plan A and plan B and then plan C fails, then we think about improvising. So I think then that really tells us about how embedded this jazziness is in our pre-colonial cultures, pre-slave trade. So I think when we speak about our past, we have to be careful not to be selective of an African past that was hijacked and define that as our very past, but there is a past that was not hijacked. There is a past that defines us. But in terms of like the jazz and how it connects with the American jazz, it's obvious. In the 1930s, actually, already Kaluza recorded the first ragtime album in South Africa. I mean, in the 30s already. And in the 50s, the jazz epistles were already with King Kong in the UK, in the US. So there were all these encounters with the American jazz, but also the South African contributions are very strong, especially in the UK. For instance, when you speak to a lot of musicians my age in the UK, they tell you about the Blue Notes, and that's how they define jazz. And Blue Note was this group from South Africa that came through in exile in the 1960s after the Sharpeville massacre, and situations were really unbearable. One author, David Coplin, says, it's either you fight or flight. That was the period. So it's either you left the country or deal with what Salim Washington calls the exile experience, that there were people that had to deal with the physical trauma, being beaten up by cops and all of these things that were dehumanizing. On the one hand, these people in exile were also like imagining home and creating more definitions of what you could call home beyond geographics. They were creating other constructs of home. So I think that our past doesn't only live in South Africa, but when we speak about South African jazz, we have to think about, you know, all these branches that have happened through these political climates over time.
It's interesting to talk about how narratives emerge out of oppression, and I just wanted to consider, is it problematic when we think that oftentimes, I think people assume when you're coming from a place such as the African continent, that you're supposed to show up with response to the politics, or you're supposed to show up with a response to a social narrative. You're supposed to, this isn't so much about jazz specifically, but about the role of the African artist, the voice that we have to shift narratives, to contribute to the public imaginary, to helping people reimagine how we think about ourselves, how they think about the African continent as a whole. Do you think it's important that we always locate, you know, African experiences from a place of struggle or from a place of post-colonialism, from that lens? I'm thinking about, there was one quote also from Hugh Masekela when he talked about how, you know, people oftentimes, he and Miriam Makeba, they talk about, you know, did they have to, people would often ask them, well, is this music coming out of your politics? Is it that? And for them, they're like, we're just actually up here singing the truth, right? It's not necessarily about the politics, but we're just here trying to be honest with our hearts and honor our people in the struggle that we're in. But is that something that we always have to locate ourselves in? And does that get in our way in terms of the cultural narratives we're trying to push forward on a global cultural stage? Anybody can take that.
Well, I ask myself, how can we not? How can we not refer to a status that was true, that oppression and colonization was taking place, and the narrative that documents Bakanga music that sits in a library was not written by anybody else but somebody who was privileged to do that from their own perspective. But also, how can we separate that when we're going through that right now, you know, where we're taking the knee because of the environments around us, you know, if I were to make an example, that there is no way that we cannot express ourselves within those confines. But more than anything else, how can we also not understand that when you listen to the way the music comes through, I've always found it fascinating that you can smile and cry and be joyous at the same time in one music, because that's really what the art is about, and that's what That's what the creators do in essence. So I find it difficult to remove all of that and just say it needs to sit independent of all of that.
Yeah, I think I agree. Also, the other truth alongside that is the fact that, you know, stronger definitions of black experience exist in a very silent history of the pre-colonial as well. So, well, both in curriculum and how we study music, but even in high school in South Africa, our history would, the first page would be Jan van Riebeeck arrived in the Cape in 1652. So I find that to be problematic, because therefore it suggests to me that there are no prehistories. And I think that's where this kind of conflict sort of emerges, that in the ways we define ourselves, does it always have to be entirely embedded on this experience and our encounter with the West, or there is a kind of deeper listening to an echo? And that's really what I'm interested in. It's like, you know, I've been lately reading a lot of, you know, the Akan proverbs. So I'm in those kind of spaces. So I'm looking and asking myself, what is left? Because, you know, we caught up so much on what's been done to us. And we have all the reasons to be, because there is the physical trauma, there is the mental trauma, which Biko was trying to respond to, but also Brazil Ngawana terms it the vandalism of the soul, which is trying to say that beyond us being vandalized as people living here, but also our ancestry realm, you know, is in many ways caught in these conflicts themselves. So even our point of reference to ideas of God, ideas of worship, ideas of ritual, needs a deeper sort of connectedness. So for me, then I really try to figure out what is left and how I could at least give my kids the same experience that I got from my grandmother, where she was telling me stories that are beautiful about people falling in love, about, you know, so many other things. My problem is that, like, it doesn't always have to be said when we have to speak about such great histories of the African continent. There's so much, the pyramids. How many times do you sit with your friends over a cup of coffee and just celebrate this great contribution that is evidence of, like, the greatest civilization? So I think there's always a need to be not selective as well about what is our history and what is not. If we have to deal with history, then I think it's important that we consider the colonial and the pre-colonial in the same way, and also confront those conflicts. I mean, also because our identities, pretty much, so many things were colonized. When it comes to our cultures, you know, our history was colonized, was hijacked, but also when it comes to the ways in which we think of ourselves as being connected to some kind of spiritualness. So I try to keep that part at least sacred in my music. And someone was writing that, you know, it's there is a bit of unfairness when it comes to the early musicologists, at least in South Africa. These people were not musicologists by profession. These were guys with notebooks that just came to the country. And all of a sudden, we as academics, we have to recycle that knowledge that has so many inaccuracies. So along with these conversations, there is also a need to remap. There is a need to remap, to reimagine. Yes. And I think our space of reference is really the pre-colonial. I know it's a very difficult and a very abstract idea to sort of engage because we don't know much, but there's a lot left in the caves, the rock arts, in our music, in our proverbs, in our languages. And those as spaces of citations, those as some kind of archive space, we could learn so much from opening up to a broader narrative of our history.
And I just want to say that as a songwriter, composer, I try to come from a space of wholeness, and the wholeness is the spectrum of the rootedness, whether that's historical, familial, genealogical, whether it's what my country has gone through or what I have gone through, what my family has gone through, to what we celebrate. So when you express the wholeness of yourself through music, when you then encounter questions about your music that only reference the political situation of the last 30 years, it is incredibly frustrating. It is incredibly frustrating.
It is.
And it happens over and over again. And on the other hand, I understand that there are not that many Ethiopians in a public sphere that are accessible for people to ask questions to. So when people want to know certain things, they tend to go into these very wide swath lanes, you know, or where have the trenches been dug deep? You know, they want to ask you about whatever whatever situation is like popping out most, either historically or politically or in the news. But in music, in the wholeness, those things end up clashing, and it can be really, really tough, you know, to be an artist, traveling all over the world, talking to people, and the first thing after a concert is, tell me about the recent political situation. And you know, I mean, it's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's not that I don't want to talk about it. I'm absolutely open to talking about it, but it cannot be the only questions.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it's so frustrating.
I'd love for us to kind of shift, and you know, we've been reflecting on the past and what cultural memory, how cultural memory kind of gets us to where we are, and but I really want to talk about the current scene. You know, I think a lot of people here, I'm assuming, are interested in knowing about the current pulse of African music, of jazz on the African continent at this particular moment. Right now, you know, Africa is kind of en vogue, and people are so curious about all the culture that's coming out of the continent. It's been there, as we've been talking about, but suddenly there's a real interest in what's going on the continent in a different way. I think people who weren't as interested are suddenly interested, or suddenly feel as though there's something we have to contribute to the global cultural stage. And so I'm really curious. I think Brenda, being a producer and radio host, I would love to hear you talk about, you know, the current creative music scene. We can call it jazz, or we can call it creative music in South Africa. How is it thriving? How is it shifting? What are the shifts that are actually helping it move forward, so that we're getting more of those sounds, and we're beginning to know more about those artists here?
Quite a question. You know, I find that probably as a result of also what's happening in the UK, everybody is raving about the UK jazz scene. South Africa is going through the same phase, I find, and other markets within, you know, particularly the new creators. But also I find it interesting how the paths are crossing. For instance, some of the most iconic albums released, Nduduzo, you know, Shabaka Hutchins, you know, and other cats from different outfits in South Africa are coming together and doing work across borders, you know, and across the seas. And there's more of that than anything else. But I find that young people with the knowledge in their hands, with the access to media and information, making much more bolder decisions about expression, especially about, I think, identity as well. And I think it's thriving also because they can independently produce projects of their own. They can, and they can choose what message that they want to portray. So there's a huge, exciting scene that is emerging out of South Africa. But I also find that it's very independent. It's happening more in the artistic spaces than there is a concerted design to kind of enable it, which I find it interesting because it thrives regardless of all of that. So I feel the artist community is taking shape again, you know, taking care of their own interest in a particular fashion.
And Nduduzo, as being somebody who's inside of that scene, what do you, how can you paint a picture? I mean, I come to South Africa quite a bit, and this is a conversation about the continent, but there are only, you know, a few countries represented up here, so we're going to talk mostly about those countries.
Yeah.
But as somebody who works, mostly is based there, is a bright light inside of that scene. Can you paint a picture for those people who have not had an opportunity to perhaps travel there and talk about what that music scene is? Like, what is it as an artist in South Africa today? What does it mean to be a jazz musician in South Africa today? Are there compromises that people have to make to cut through? Are there regional specificities that you have to kind of honor in order to really make a career there, and do they translate to this side? So if you just, you can answer any or none of those questions, but just speak your heart.
Somi. I think most importantly, the jazz scene in South Africa is one of the most exciting scenes for many reasons. One of the reasons is that the country has a very long history, as we have reflected, of this music. And for me, what's really interesting now is to see how some people are becoming very deliberate about immortalizing some of those voices, like in the same way that people would think of Charlie Parker and his importance as a symbol in a particular culture. So I see a lot of that happening now in the country. I think in the post 1994, when South Africa had its first elections, there was a lot of ideas that came through Rainbow Nation, and I think at so many registers that created some level of illusion. And I think that the jazz scene that has kind of followed that until, for me at least, around the 2009-2010, when the Fees Must Fall campaigns would emerge, the decolonization of the curriculum. And I think the scene for me really became interesting then, when you had people that, for instance, like Tumi Mokhorosi, who was a brilliant drummer, that recorded a project called Elo. People were reflecting on the Fanon text. Someone like Busile Kaba, thinking about his lineage from a strong sort of Maskanda guitar playing that comes from KwaZulu-Natal, but also the North, Bob Philip Daban and all of these things. So I think there is a generation now in South Africa that is very conscious about the past and looking for ways of immortalizing that. And I think that has produced some really interesting soundings where it's not really, the scene is not caught in these notions of modernity. Because sometimes I feel like when people think about modernity, it's about leaving something behind and be like, well, this is the new jazz, you know what I mean? And this is Brenda spoke about this idea of looking back, this idea of the Sankofa symbol, which is always referencing. So I think I'm feeling a lot of that now, but also I think people are very also conscious about the different dialects, because we have like 11 official languages, but also we have like sub-languages, like different dialects. And people are very conscious about drawing from those spaces now to inform the articulations of the music. And I think that's maybe partly why there's a great excitement now about the South African jazz scene, because in the same way that the epistles were very clear about the articulation, Kipi Meketse came from Charlie Parker, but you could definitely tell a South African thing, in the same way that Mselewu came from Makhathini, but he embraced cultural things that happened around him that informed his articulation. So I think we are that generation that is very, connected in many ways.
Meklit, could you, when we think about what these contributions have been so far, and we think about all of the people from Hugh Masekela and Kaifa Semenya, Abdullah Ibrahim, Miriam Makeba, Mulatu Astatke, Randy Weston, so many people who've been so much about that conversation of African music and this idiom. It feels like there's been a lull between then and now. There's like this strong kind of resurgence of voices, which is really exciting. But what do we think that lull is about? And what has shifted so that these new voices might emerge with so much force and gravitas and number and mass, right?
Well, just to, of course, speak about Ethiopia, the that era of Ethiopian music that where Ethio jazz was created in the late 60s and the early 70s was very, very firmly cut off by the Ethiopian Revolution. And when that happened, the government imposed curfews. So at 6 p.m. or so, which was about sundown, people had to be inside, and that just killed the clubs. Nobody could go out anymore. The musicians all lost their livelihoods. And what also happened simultaneously as that revolution over the next few years became communist, Ethiopia started getting a lot of support from Russia. And simultaneous to that, Russia started flooding Ethiopia with cheap keyboards. So you started to get a shutting down of the live and acoustic music scene, and suddenly all these keyboards that were available. Strange, right? So you see how the economic systems, like the economic system of Russia was like, we'll sell these there. Okay, so then what you get is that people couldn't really get together and play. And so you started to get these one-person bands where it was all programmed drums and people were programming the saxophone sounds and everything. And so there's this period of Ethiopian music in the 80s and even up through the early 90s that is very, very digital, like in a not so good way, you know? Like and what happened was when the government changed in 91, and then that really formalized in 1995, it was only after that time that the curfews were lifted and people started to be able to play music at night, which meant that it took a few years after that for clubs to begin to reopen, and a few years after that for people to actually develop bands and ensembles that were filling those places and playing. And then on top of that, it took a little bit longer for the ear to reconnect to the idea of acoustic music as being a viable thing that you could dance to, go see for entertainment, invite to your weddings, and all of this stuff, you know. So around the early 2000s, you know, 2004, 5, 6, you start to see this resurgence of acoustic music and Ethiopian jazz happening again. But the challenge there was then that the young people who had not experienced that kind of heyday started thinking of Ethio jazz as being a music from the past. Yep. It became something like, oh, well, that was what they did then. What are we going to do now? And so it really took a long time for that baton to be passed and for people to feel like, okay, we can embrace this music as something that can be present time, contemporary, current. And what's really, really shifted that now is the rise of a whole new series of Ethiopian television stations. I would say that the biggest amongst them is called Ghana. It was started by one of the founders of MTV who had an Ethiopian wife, and so he started Ghana TV, and Ghana has been really, really, really supportive of the live music scene. They do all kinds of profiles of traditional musicians, jazz musicians, and they have started doing all kinds of live performances, and all of those go on television. A lot of people have Ghana, so whereas before people who would go to clubs maybe had a little bit of extra money to spare, now Ghana is everywhere. And so the idea of this music, of Ethio jazz as being a contemporary music, is reaching people that it never could have reached before. It's reaching people far outside of Addis Ababa, and now Ghana is also part of the digital distribution networks going across the African continent. So that music has a new platform, so that's really contributing to a resurgence of Ethio jazz.
Thank you for that.
I just wanted to,
Yeah, thank you.
sorry, thank you. I just wanted to say, I also realized that there's a huge young following of jazz music that we find in South Africa. And it you know, surprisingly, you know, especially because I've been listening to what Meklit has been saying, there's more younger audience that is following the music.
Yeah.
That is, and whereas everybody used to think this is old people's music. So it's quite an interesting turn of events.
So I think what's also really interesting about, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was so interested in the whole idea of the Russians and them bringing keyboards. Because you know, the early sort of British encounters, and in the early 1900s, the missionaries brought with them upright pianos in South Africa, mostly in the Cape side. And as a result now, you could go to the sort of poorest townships where people can't afford, but there is always an upright piano sitting there at the corner. These were just given to people by the missionaries. And also that there is a somewhat, now I'm just thinking back, because Agao writes beautifully about how colonization was partly informed by tonality. And so now I'm just thinking about the first encounters when the colonizers came to the continent. The first challenge was the music and language and the dances and everything. Everything was foreign, the polyrhythms, but also the tuning, the way we sing and intonation and all those kind of things. And Agao says part of what the missionaries then did by bringing these organs, these pianos, was to colonize tonality so that people, sort of subscribe to this like 440 idea, this standard tuning, instead of the whole micro tones kind of things that were available to people, and go into details about how these things were necessary for expression and how they vibrated with the surrounding, our landscapes and all of that. So it's really interesting to think about how the keyboard has been used as well as this sort of a kind of colonial system that colonizes the music to conform within particular ways of articulating the sound. But not that that's the only thing, not also to suggest that these things, the chromatic was not there in the pre-colonial, obviously. I mean, you listen to Amahubo that were popularized by Princess Magogo. And also just to mention the kind of the new things that are happening, Mbuso Khoza is remembering Princess Magogo in his music in a big way. And so all of these scales, we have them in our cultures. They existed thousands and thousands of years. But it's very interesting, the arrival of the keyboard and the arrival of the pianos in South Africa.
I think what we would all agree to is that there is a new sense of kind of personal agency in the cultural communities, in the arts communities, in the music communities, in the jazz community on the continent. And perhaps, Nduduzo, to ask you to speak about what does it mean to kind of hold fast to that personal agency at this time when, as I said, there is, time's up. No, it's not. At this time, what does it mean to hold fast to personal agency during this time when people are so interested in what Africans have to say, finally interested in kind of bringing the African voice onto the global cultural stage? And I'm interested I'm asking you specifically as this, person who's been given this opportunity as the first Africa-based artist to be signed to the iconic Blue Note Records. What does that mean for you to take on, to step into that and to hold fast to how do you negotiate personal agency, I suppose, when you're entering certain spaces that have otherwise been something in many ways intangible for the majority of a community, of African jazz musicians?
Yeah. Wow, that question is loaded. I think Sis B on her interview when I got signed, the Blue Note deal was announced, she asked me the same question, the kind of like responsibility then that it comes with at this time, and well, for me it's a lot of things. I also think that this opportunity that I'm sort of getting now is not an opportunity just for me, but it's an opportunity to vocalize some of the sentiments that my community has. So like I say, I'm not the only jazz musician in South Africa. I'm definitely not the only jazz pianist. South Africa has so many exciting piano players, Afrikam Kize. It's just that what has been happening, I think, is that a lot of the musicians have been having encounters with Europe. Most of us have been going more to Europe. But with the initiatives that Somi also a part of, I see these bridges that we're always talking about, these bridges to the diaspora becoming more stronger. And for me, I don't feel a kind of pressure in any way, more than just like, well, this exists anyway in South Africa and in the continent, and maybe an opportunity to vocalize it shouldn't be that difficult. If people are ready, we've always been ready. So that's the kind of thing that I'm feeling. It's like I can't carry the problem that people have not been aware of our, jazz scene. That can't really be my problem. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to vocalize that. So I kind of feel it should be very natural.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
As we're
you.
doing something that we've always been doing, I think. Yeah.
Meklit, can you talk a little bit about the Nile project, what it is, what the successes and challenges were? I'd love for you to share, did it only operate in the space of world music, and is that a rightful label, or should it have moved beyond that? But really just to share some of the successes and challenges. And how are those categorizations problematic, if it was categorized as world music?
Yes. Okay, that's a lot. So the Nile project was a project that I co-founded back in 2011, and along with an Egyptian ethnomusicologist by the name of Mina Girgis. And the Nile project brought together musicians from the 11 countries of the Nile to create music together, and also to model the type of cross-cultural communication that we wanted to see around how we share our resources. So to be a model for people who were working in ecology and in infrastructure, to be able to create the kinds of connections that we wanted to see and how they were working together. And I'll just go through the countries of the Nile because most people don't know. And from south to north, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt. Well, that was kind of regionally, not really south to north regionally. But and the reason that this project was relevant is because there was all kinds of challenge around how the water of the Nile is shared. That is still very much an active issue today. The project brought together a collective. The collective is now around 60 musicians from the countries of the Nile. We did multiple residencies where we would all take turns teaching each other about our music. So in the mornings, there would be workshops, and in the afternoons, we would do co-composing and co-arranging sessions. And so just between us, it was like this glorious experience, of getting to know your neighbors, your river neighbors. And just this stunning fact that we were so close to each other, sharing an environment without actually knowing each other very well. And the question that we could then ask the world was, how well do you know the people with whom you share an ecology? And how does that knowledge then impact the way that we all have to manage a 21st century that will be resource scarce for each and every one of us wherever you are in the world? So the project had a lot of successes. We toured multiple times in East Africa, and as well as in Europe, and 2 tours of North America. I think that, referencing something that you said in Nduduzo, one thing we were really trying to put forth is that what does modernity mean musically, and why can't it mean an interaction amongst ourselves rather than something that, okay, now we're taking something from the West and therefore we're being more modern. It's like, no, it doesn't have to be that way. And so we were trying to discover that for ourselves. We really were very much put in the context on the continent of contemporary music. And in North America and in Europe, it was very much world music, even though we had not only did we have jazz musicians and contemporary musicians and experimental musicians, but even the musicians who were playing the traditional flutes or who were playing traditional drums or instruments, they were all experimental with their instruments. So for example, one of the Egyptian musicians who played an instrument called simsameya in Egypt, kirar in Ethiopia. There are many names for these same instruments that lived across, along the river. He had expanded the instrument to have 21 strings, whereas it had normally had 6 to 8 strings. And so you would look at it from a Western perspective and see something traditional, but from an Egyptian perspective, it would be like, I've never seen anything like that before. So it was a real challenge for us to be so pigeonholed into the world music category, because there was so much experimentation was at the very, very, very heart of what we were doing, and especially the fact that these musics had not been deeply entwined with each other. Many of them had not been deeply entwined with each other ever before. And then just thinking of it as a collective model, so it's not a band. The Nile project was not a band. It's not like there are these 10 musicians and they're always together. We were constantly creating different iterations, and like, why not one day have an electronic version or a hip-hop version, one that was focused on jazz musicians. Like, there actually could be so much multiplicity within those contexts. And so the project really required coming at it with a lens of a prism, right? The light that breaks into many. That's how we really thought of it. And it's very frustrating then to also be, okay, you're from Africa, it's world music. It's like, well, we know that those categories are slim. We know they're thin. So let's make them more robust in our minds, in our questioning, in our interactions, and make those building bridges, like you were saying, at the very heart of how we relate to each other.
Thank you for that. Before we open it up to the audience, well, firstly, I just want to ask, do you guys think that African jazz is a title that we need to perpetuate, to use, to latch on to?
You know, when we talked about this hosting of this global event, everybody said the big question that you must settle on is the question of what is jazz, you know. And I think it's an ongoing debate, and I think one of the reasons why we're interested in opening up a dialogue amongst African artists is to be able to engage within a bigger platform on these questions. I mean, it's always amazing to sit with you, Somi, with Nduduzo, and just listen to the questions that the African artist is asking. You know, the question of languaging those issues within. You know, and I'll just make a quote or two. Abdullah Ibrahim says that people think that slave ships brought slaves to wherever they landed, but they brought people that were.
Can you speak into the mic a little bit more?
Can I speak into the microphone? Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. You know, when Abdullah says the slave ships didn't take slaves out of Africa, they took, you know, they took doctors, they took people that were capable with skills, and but also Mulatu Astatke or Ray Lema would always say that people must go back to the bush to get the information, you know, and whenever you go to the bush, in fact, I was reminded yesterday, I was listening to a panel of vocalists, and they were talking about the whole issue of scatting and what is and what is not. I think at the moment in Africa, we're grappling with those issues of saying, how do we bring all these other innovations, or should I say, practices into jazz, and then have to grapple with, you know, whether it's jazz or not, you know, and the question is, whose answer is it, and whose responsibility is it, you know? And in the meantime, we talk about a thriving jazz sector, like in South Africa, for instance. So the question then becomes, you know, this is a global language. This is a language of humanity. This is a migrant language that is jazz, you know. And I think where it sits has its own permutations, but it's about the embracing of that. That's my belief in terms of just dignifying what other musicians are doing from other parts of the world. And it opens the doors. I think it creates a better opportunity for the bridges that you're talking about, you know, across the Atlantic and all other spaces, that the lending should be on a positive note of recognizing one another and what can happen with the two different conversations to create together.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I think it is a wonderful way to end by talking about bridges, right? Because the work that we do, we can't operate in a silo, right? The work of an artist, the journey of an artist, the journey of a cultural worker is inherently interdependent and collaborative.
Sure.
So it's important that we talk about what it is to create those kind of opportunities and bridges, right? And I think for this audience in particular, I'm assuming there are people here who might be presenters, booking agents, artists, looking for opportunities of how to engage, because I think we've been sitting here reflecting on our experience as African artists and cultural workers. But, you know, can we talk a little bit about the opportunities that actually are available for artists? Because I think most people, when they think about, from a touring point of view, they think about coming to South Africa specifically. I mean, obviously South Africa has had a monumental contribution to jazz across the waters, and so that's always the first thing. But I think even in terms of touring opportunities for artists over here in the United States in this scene, people oftentimes think about Cape Town Jazz Festival or Joy of Jazz in Johannesburg. They don't really know about Bamako Jazz Festival or Lagos Jazz Series or Safaricom in Nairobi, or Abidjan has another one, I don't remember what it's called. But anyway, Abidjan Jazz Festival, we'll call it that. Yes, what is it called? It's called Desgad Abidjan Jazz Fest. So there's so many that are available throughout the continent. They're emerging. A lot of them aren't necessarily as well funded and are as well, publicized, but they are there. And I've tried to be intentional in my own path to say yes to those things. And that means, by saying yes, that means I have to go then and do the grant writing to get the funds to subsidize the fees that are being offered, right? If Sauti za Busara in Tanzania asks, oh, can you come? And they're like, I'm sorry, we only have $200 per person. That's an absolute no, normally, right? Mm-hmm. To travel across the waters with a band and people to take care of, including yourself. But then you have to do the work to say, this is an important conversation, this is an important exchange, and let me go and apply for a grant. There are opportunities for funding, but I think I'd love to hear you guys quickly talk about, I say quickly because we don't have too much time, and I'd love to open it up to the audience, to talk about what are the opportunities that present themselves for the touring jazz musician, or even for people who are working in the jazz industry or who are just jazz enthusiasts and are passionate about the music and want to bring resources there or find connections on the continent. What do those opportunities look like?
For sure.
Let me just take a bite at that. There's always indicators that any funding model must meet. Sometimes you are looking at an artistic exploration, and somebody is looking at how it meets their bottom line. And I think that is the current status that we're working around, and it will remain. But it's to be smart about it. But for us at the moment, we're just talking about how it is we're trying to get an understanding of what the sector is about. It means, therefore, that there's also opportunities of documenting, of tracing where the music sits in South Africa in terms of exile. There's amazing jazz music, Johnny Jani, I can name a whole lot of them whose music is sitting outside our borders, scattered all over there. And it's time for it to reflect on our television screens, to be used in the schoolrooms and all of that. So I think the opportunity for an industry that is, for instance, established as this one, the issues of documenting, creating memory, and how there could be partnerships of that nature would be very beneficial. But also for it, I think for me, the values that need to live in those agreements, because I think in the coming to Africa again, there should be some kind of a give and take that is mutually beneficial to everyone. But the opportunity of documenting and creating memory and helping us is a great opportunity to collaborate.
Maybe just to add, there's been a lot of collaborations between the South Africans and the Swiss, more specifically But how those collaborations have been functioning is that the Swiss government, through Proevicia, has been putting funds to support those kind of initiatives. It's like normally just groups that tour in the continent and come back to Europe, which is a collaboration between the South Africans and the Swiss. Similar things, we have something called Concerts SA as well, that has been like doing a lot of installments as well around national things that, you know, allow people to come. But I still feel that there's a lot more that we need. There's a lot more. These opportunities aren't sufficient. I mean, I work for a music department, and it's exciting to see how these young musicians grow. You have them for a BMaster degree. You spend 4 years with them, and you sit there on the graduation day and think about opportunities now for these guys. After these 4 years, there's still quite a challenge with opportunities. There's a big influx. We have 3 sort of major universities that produce great jazz musicians every year, but there aren't enough opportunities. So I think there is a need for us to sort of collaborate with, you know, other people from elsewhere in the world to sort of, you know, amplify what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Skills.
Yeah.
I'll agree with you that, you know, in Ethiopia we definitely need a lot more opportunities for our young musicians there. One thing that has been a huge opportunity in Ethiopia is the fact that the AU is housed in Addis Ababa, which means that the level of international conferences that's going through Ethiopia is just huge. It's just there's giant both continent-wide and global conferences happening there all the time, and they're very hungry for musical content. And so these end up being like a real source of either sustenance for the musicians who live there, or can help to call the diaspora to home to be involved. And there's also festivals like the Salon Festival, which is a joint venture between Ethiopia and some Ethiopians who migrated many years ago to Sweden. And there was, for a long time, the Acacia Jazz Festival. There used to be this great deal on Ethiopian Airlines, which they cut a few years ago, where if you flew to Ethiopia from the US, you could go anywhere else that Ethiopian Airlines went for the taxes and airport fees. Just that. So every time I would go to Ethiopia, I would always go to another country in Africa to play. Unfortunately, that is no longer. But yes, we do need more opportunities, but there are also some interesting ones, especially with the conferences that are unexpected and also under the radar, and you can always add shows once you're already there.
Right. I think I would also just encourage everyone here who's in some way interested in participating in the burgeoning African cultural economies and the jazz scene that is there, that is presenting itself, and the talent that is there. I think, you know, we have a tendency, we have the privilege over here to kind of want to do long-term strategy, we're very much about in the moment on the ground, I think, you know, but so I think that's sort of the nature of most of these spaces that you'll show up. Not that we don't do our own long-term planning, but that you can show up and actually make magic happen, mostly because your dollars are longa in Africa, right? And so they are, you know, so I think it's important to think about how a small amount of resource from this part of the world in a short amount of time can do incredible things for an artist, for a cultural space, for an organization. So just try to be mindful of that. If you're feeling inspired, know that you can actually be part of that bridge-making work, and quite easily. So I'm just going to open it up to the audience. If there are any questions you might have. There's a microphone right here in the center, sir. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Ray Blue, and I want to just what Nduduzo was saying. I had the fortune of doing work in Africa, in South Africa in particular, which was my first trip to the continent, and it made in Cape Town, Joburg. I had the opportunity to play at the Makufe Festival, Bloemfontein, a couple of times. I knew Zim, Nelson Mankuko, etc. McCoy, good man. What you said about funding, I know for a fact that the European countries have ministries of culture, and they finance the send their people.
Yeah.
Okay, to and do partnerships in different countries. In America, we don't have that. We don't have a Ministry of Culture here, and we have to be industrious, and we have to be creative, and we have to be able to seek out where different fundings are. I have done a number of different things in Africa. I've had State Department tours in Gabon, Tanzania, and a couple other countries. But I'm very, very interested in coming back and doing more. I have a whole book of South African-based tunes that I've written, and I have a project with that as well. So to say all of that, yes, I am very interested in coming back, and I'd like to talk with each of you about that type of thing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
My name is Russ Davis. For the last 20 years, I've done the jazz program Jazz America for the Voice of America. And my predecessor, Willis Conover, started his jazz program and did it for 40 years, mostly reaching behind the Iron Curtain. And now most of my listeners are in Africa and Pacific Rim. So I feel very connected to Africa. I've done a number of specials, Thank You Africa, because I want to remind people there how much has been contributed to American art from Africa, and the fact that we are all Africans. We all rose up from 4 to 2 in the Fertile Crescent and started hunting and gathering. But it all started there, and I remind folks of that fact. I know I have a million questions I'd like to ask, and you've answered quite a bit. I'd like to know what the club scene is like all over the continent, and it's almost impossible. Say you want to come to America, right? Where are you going to go? The club scene, though, there is a bit of connectivity. Do the countries work with one another to create sort of a circuit for musicians like Ray to play, where you could go to the club in Mali and then go to Senegal and then go to Addis Ababa and then go to Accra and then go to Cape Town and Johannesburg and Lagos and Nairobi, etc. Is it extensive enough where they could actually set up a tour and do the clubs and then also make the concert halls and the festivals? And also, how cognizant are the people of Africa, another general question and a giant one, of how significant the contribution, are they aware of what happened in Congo Square when the music was created and their contribution?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You want to take it?
Well, I could reflect on jazz venues. It's actually interesting that one of our students in the department is here, and she's currently writing about the demise of jazz venues in South Africa. And recently we had a beautiful venue, which was a rare sort of breed where you have all the acoustics really perfect, and you have an acoustic piano, and you have an audience that comes to these gigs. But the venue closed, was it last year or the year before now? It was 2018? Yeah. So there was really an amazing space. We also had another space called the African Freedom Station, which was really hugely alternative, and the space that we really loved, where people could do all kinds of explorations, from painting to poetry, creative writing and jazz, but also that closed down. But I think just in the history of South Africa, unlike in the US, where you still find Zinc Bar, you still find, Smalls and all Blue Note and all of these historic spaces. In South Africa, we used to have the baseline, Kippies and all of these beautiful venues. But there's a decline in that, and we've been trying to think, and especially through the writing of some of the students that are interested in writing about these things, whether this is because of not having a strong enough culture that follows the musicians around, following the scene, but also we're discovering that actually that's not true, because currently we have like a huge scene followed by photographers, videographers. We have interesting writers, journalists, radio personnel. So I think we're just not getting enough support from the government. We do have the Minister of Arts and Culture, but I don't think it's, what's the word, proactive enough. I don't think they're reaching out enough. So maybe you can.
Just to jump in there without negating everything that you've said, I think also is the shifting way the industry is working right now. Today, any venue that puts on a stage can accommodate an artist and people can appreciate music. So even the festivals are changing from being huge machines where you find very small intimate settings. So there is a diversifying of the spaces, but it doesn't, and I think to go back to what I was trying to say earlier on, is that I was interested in a discussion there was part of this which talked about the jazz economy or the night economy. And I know that, for instance, in South Africa, Buena and them have done a great research on that from the South African Music Rights Organization, to be able to really find a sense of how to create a continuum of some sort, an ecosystem. There's also a first time that I see in Southern Africa, a festival circuit called Igota, which is a number of festivals in Southern Africa at the moment that are trying to address the questions that you're asking. So there are mushrooming opportunities, and it's really about nailing them down to what they mean. And the more we have an increase in those, the more because even for the policymakers in government, it's for them to understand the economics of this. And when I said we need those skills and exchange of knowledge, it's so that we can better articulate how opportune the time is in many ways. Yeah.
I'll also just thank you for those responses. I'll also just answer in terms of the touring circuit. Right now, there are kind of three ways that people can tour the continent. One is through kind of colonial relics, which is going through the State Department, he mentioned that, which is a wonderful opportunity, is a wonderful program, but it still depends very much on outside funding to bring people to the continent. There's also some Alliance Française, I believe we have one here on the east side in New York, the French Cultural Center. There's one in every major African city, every major metropole on the continent has an Alliance Française. And essentially, and they don't actually respond. They don't report to the Ministry of Culture in France. They report to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which really speaks to the colonial policy that the French people had, which was about how to make people French and how to make them cultured and sophisticated, very different approach than the British colonial policy. So there's this sort of ecosystem that has remained and sustained for a long time throughout the whole, most of Sub-Saharan, I think even North Africa as well. So you can actually plug into that particular scene, but they also do it regionally. So that's another way you can do a regional tour. She mentioned Ikota, which is the festival network in Southern Africa, and also a second way would be through corporate sponsorships. Usually people are only in conversation, the major telecoms, unfortunately they operate independently in each of these countries. So you might have a performance opportunity in Nigeria that's sponsored by MTN, a major telecom company, and also there's an MTN office in Ghana, and then if they're both interested and their budgets can work, then fine, but you really have to go a long route through a corporate sponsorship process and proposal, if you will. And then again, that's such a heavy lifting journey that you end up limiting it to one or two, maybe three markets. And then the third one is through just independent artists, having conversation with community. But for the most part, many of these festivals aren't necessarily I'll say outside of Southern Africa. Many of these festivals are happening at different times, and they're not necessarily thinking about how do we try to route everybody together in the way that you would go through the European tour circuit in the summertime, or we definitely need more of that. But the independent route would be to reach out to community, reach out to the different people who have a sense of what that music scene is, what are the spaces, and I think people have to surrender themselves to understanding that
Yes.
perhaps our way of listening or engaging with the music is different from how people are listening and engaging with music here in the West and in the US, right? So the club scene, if you tell a jazz musician here, like there's a club tour I'm gonna do, they're probably going to show up expecting a very specific type of experience. So I think it's important that people are culturally and socially malleable to understand that these are different cultural spaces, different cultural economies, and we're also kind of forming our own ways of being with the music and with each other around the artists.
And
Go ahead.
thank you, Somi. That
Yeah,
was
sure.
great. And I just also want to say that if you are gonna go, like, leave room on either side, because there's a sense of once you're on the ground, you can get so much done that you
Yep.
just cannot get done from here. So, for example, when I'm going to Ethiopia, people will be like, "Great, call me when you're there," and then I'll get 5 more gigs once I've
That's right.
actually landed.
That's totally right.
And so it's important to come to the continent with a sense of anchor and flexibility.
Yeah, best advice. I think we're out of time, but we can take one more question if that's okay with the people.
I'll make it
with
very
them.
quick. My name is Robinville Stevens from Jazzmobile.
Hi.
Thanks. At the very beginning of my career, when I started in the 20s, when I was 20, thank you very much. I'm not that old. But what do they say about good black? Anyway, in my early 20s, I took about 400 Americans, about 24 musicians to Dakar, Senegal, for a jazz festival that my client and I recreated. And the funding for that came from TCB Alberto Culver hair care products.
Wow.
And we raised $120,000 for the trip. So I guess what I was going to say is 2 things. One, it was interesting when I went, we took Frank Foster, Frank West, Aaron Bell, Billy Taylor, Irene Reed. So it was a phenomenal festival. But we were looking for an opening act, and I insisted that it be from a local group from Dakar, Senegal. And it was interesting to find that, well, again, this was a long time ago, but there was a school where young people were being taught jazz music, but they had never been instructed by an American jazz artist. So what we ended up doing very quickly, we went to some of these musicians, my dad being one of them, and we did masterclass sessions for these students. And then we did an audition, and then we chose a group for an opening act. So my question is, what's happening in the education scene? And in when we talk about the continent, you talk about doing tours. I think, okay, so if my hand is continent, this is continent of Africa, this is the U.S., so it's much bigger than doing a tour in the U.S., much bigger than trying to do a tour in Europe. But in terms of education, what kind of programs are there? Are there schools? Are there programs within the schools? And I know in Senegal, Catholic schools were considered the private schools everybody wanted to go to. So I'm just curious to know, what is the education scene?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah.
Being a professor at
Well,
Forte.
yeah, we do have a lot of music programs that people can start learning music from high schools. I mean, then another thing is just the issue of classes, the social classes, because many black communities are still in the townships, and music is not necessarily at primary school, high school. So, but if you can afford for your kid to study in a private school, then they get. So there are all of these challenges. And when it comes to tertiary education, people are taken based on their musical background. And when they say musical background, they mean a formal sort of training. And they don't consider any of the traditional ceremonies that you've attended, so many songs and repertoires that come with each of them. So when you come to an audition, they ask you, can you read music? So they still, that challenge in terms of how we define even this idea of being music literate, But in tertiary education, we have a lot of music schools. And one was set up actually by Darius Brubeck, who is Dave Brubeck's son. And that has produced a lot of great musicians from Zimngawana, Lulu Gonzana, Fairfago, and really a lot of other musicians. But also that's like tertiary education. The challenge is inside the institution itself is that, for instance, I went to study music in 2001, tertiary, And I didn't know about people such as Kipi Meklit because they didn't feature in the history. So there is quite a big discourse as well about how we start to imagine a kind of plurality in terms of being aware of all the contributions that have happened, like we have spoken about, in the continent, and how those make their way into curriculum. And especially if you're dealing with jazz history, you know, in a country like South Africa, there has to be at least a chapter that deals with Ibrahim, Setima Benjamin, and all of these people. So there is an education system, but we are really trying to push the whole sort of decolonial project into how people can be reflected in the very same curriculum that they study. But we do have those opportunities, and some of our students, like currently, Nhlanhla Mahlangu, a beautiful alto player, is at Manhattan. Linda Skakane was just at New School. So we have a beautiful thing that's happening as a kind of exchange. Yeah.
And I'll also just say that I think it's important to understand that South Africa, I think you guys are at a position of privilege even in terms of the number of music schools and the education programs that are available to young South Africans or to people who want to come and study in South Africa. Because in Rwanda, for example, where I'm from, we have our first school of music, a formalized school of music, started 3 years ago by a man by the name of Popo Murigande. And, you know, so I encourage everybody here to find their way to Kigali and everywhere else to contribute your knowledge, because it's definitely needed. The master classes, the workshops, and the skills, you know, not just as musicians, but also as people who know what it is to do the kind of specific and technical specific work around that music. So I'm sorry, we're out of time. We can have conversations with you directly after, it seems. Do we have to get off the stage? There's another panel coming, so I'm so sorry, but we can have a conversation. I want to thank each of these panels. Thank you. It was so important to gather to have this conversation. So I thank you.